political status, if you will. And I think, we all start out as normies, if you will. My parents were Democrats, their parents were Democrats, and I don't know how far back it goes, but several generations of Democrats. And when it was time for me to vote, to register to vote, I was asking my relatives, what's the difference between a Democrat and a Republican? Didn't really get any clear answers. I think my dad was the one that told me that the Democrats tend to support, regular people, and the Republicans tend to support rich people. And I think I had other varying opinions, but just to be ornery, because everyone else in the family was a Democrat, I registered as a Republican, not really understanding why. And I voted sometimes, and sometimes I didn't, and I didn't really follow a lot of the political stuff that was going on until I entered into business, which was my early 20s. And I got varying opinions from some of my mentors in the business world. But I did have a strong distrust, for some reason, a strong distrust of the political leaders, leaders in quotations. And I remember coming to a point to where I actually thought that maybe I should know what's going on in the world, and so I would start to watch news. And I did recognize that the news, and this was back in the day when we had channel 6, 8, and 10, okay? And so NBC, CBS, and ABC, I think, were the ones. And so I would switch back and forth between these channels, and I noticed that they pretty much had the same spin on events, and even at the same time. And within a minute, or sometimes seconds, they would switch over to, they would give you a national weather report, and then they would say, here's what's going on in your neck of the woods, and then they'd have a quick, 30 seconds or a minute of what the weather is in, whatever their local affiliate was in the area that I lived in. So, and then it'd switch back to national news, and they would squeeze everything that was going on in the entire world in 30 minutes. And so I recognized that there was at least a management of all three of these news agencies. So early on I had a healthy skepticism as to whether or not we were getting real news. And I also recognized that I would listen to radio stations in probably this was the early 80s, and there would be reporters that would say things that went on in Congress, bills that were passed in Congress, that just sounded devastating, and not going into what they were right now. But if these bills passed, it would just be absolutely devastating for the freedoms of American citizens. Doesn't matter if right or left, or there wasn't such a big marker between the two in those days. But so it would never be on the national news. But these independent reporters on these radio stations I was listening to were either making this stuff up, or it was being overlooked by the national news. Well, being born with some level of skepticism, I just kept that, on the back shelf of my mind until I had more information. But as things would go on, as time would go on, and this would be the early 80s, so I think I got a head start on a lot of people that are, much younger than me, and started finding an interest in stuff, in my early 20s, and I'm much older now. So there were two books that were introduced to me that were really landmark in my mind, and this is what happened. We had the one book was called None Dare Call It Conspiracy, and the other was None Dare Call It Treason. And in those books, they talked about something called the Council on Foreign Relations. That was one of them. And the other was None Dare Call It Treason. Two different authors. But they talked about how the Republican Party and the Democrat Party were both connected to these organizations, the Council on Foreign Relations being the American version of the same thing that was going on in Britain and other countries. So, at the time, I found it incredible that the news, at the same time I was reading this and shortly thereafter, the news made fun of this and the whole idea that there's a Council on Foreign Relations and, this grand conspiracy and all that sort of stuff is just hogwash and, tinfoil hat conspiracy theorists and that sort of, there's no such thing. And, that was in the 80s, the early 80s. But of course, nowadays you could see, Hillary Clinton and Dick Cheney, two different times, two different events, giving their speeches to the Council on Foreign Relations with the Council on Foreign Relations moniker behind them. And so it's like it became obvious over a period of time that we are lied to by the news, and they're okay with it. Blatantly. They will just come out, and I don't think, a lot of these people, they're just talking heads. They're not really educated. They're not really researchers. They're readers, and they're really good at reading. And I believe that's what they call them in other countries. They call them readers. Over here they call them anchors. Like they're really, important people, which is laughable nowadays. And it's been said that it's easier to fool people than it is to convince them that they've been fooled. And I really have found that to be the truth. Now in the 90s, we had the Clintons campaigning, and they would just, here's this, nobody knows who this guy is, Clinton, who comes, into power, and all of a sudden he's a presidential candidate. And man, the marketing that happened, wow. And I remember my parents, being Democrats, they voted for the Clintons. Later on my dad says, yep, I did it, but I repent. So my dad had a tremendous sense of humor. Anyway, so here's the Clintons, tremendous campaigning, and the media was on their side. Wow, it was really obvious, and man, it worked. And that's when I started hearing these stories and coming across information about Mena, Arkansas, and the drug running that was going on with Mena, Arkansas. And I believe it was Clinton's second term where people were asking the questions, why don't the Republicans talk about the Clintons being involved with this drug running in Mena, Arkansas? Well, it came out later on that the Republicans were involved with it too. And evidence points to the Clintons actually being created, if you will, by the Bushes. And if you don't already know this, the Bushes go way back into power plays with bankers. Prescott Bush, during World War II, was actually in a lot of trouble with the federal government for being part of the funding apparatus for the Nazis. And then out of that, we've got George Herbert Walker Bush, who has been connected, by the way, to the assassination of JFK. And then, of course, you know, a lot happened around the JFK thing. If you haven't studied that, wow, what a rabbit hole to go down there. And if you believe that Lee Harvey Oswald was the lone gunman, I can't help you. Okay? I mean, you're going to have to do some homework on that yourself. But if you do understand that there's a whole lot of weirdness that happened around the JFK assassination, you can understand that there were deep state players involved there. Okay? There was a lot of funny goings on that just violated Secret Service protocol, and then, of course, cover-ups within federal agencies, FBI being one, but more than that. So, if you can understand that, you have to fast forward to where we're at today, because we've got bad guys in high places. And this is why the Clintons, with all the investigations and all the rumors, if you will, about the Clintons and their dirty dealings, you wonder, well, how come they haven't been indicted? Why haven't they, you know, if they were really bad guys, if this wasn't just harassment by an opposing party, you know, they would have been arrested and they'd have been tried for treason and, you know, bad stuff. But that's not where my mind went. My mind goes to, why are they protected? Because I have become convinced that there is bad stuff inside the government. And I got to the point several years ago to where I just gave up on America. I just gave up on America. I saw that our freedoms were going away. People were, you know, our representatives in Congress were giving away our freedoms. That's what America is made of, is people who are free, supposedly. Well, it's also been said that there is no people that are more enslaved than people who believe that they are free. Well, to continue, we have the Trump phenomenon. All of these people in politics and law enforcement agencies up on the higher level, who I have learned to despise, all hated Trump's guts. And so even though I was not registered to vote at the time, I could see that very possibly Trump might be the guy, if all these people over decades of time I have been suspicious of, I have felt were dirty, and yet were protected by law enforcement agencies, all hate Trump's guts. Maybe there's something to this guy.